On a normal afternoon in London, life in the park was supposed to feel ordinary. People walking, friends laughing, the quiet rhythm of a city trying to slow down for a moment of peace. But in just a matter of seconds, that normality shattered in a way that would leave witnesses shaken, and a community asking how something like this could happen in broad daylight. It was at Primrose Hill that 21-year-old film student Finbar Sullivan was reportedly attacked in front of stunned onlookers. What should have been an open, public space became the scene of a sudden and brutal confrontation involving a group of men. There was no warning that anyone could clearly identify, no chance for the moment to be diffused before it escalated into violence. Within minutes, panic spread through the crowd. People who had come to enjoy a quiet day were suddenly running, calling for help, trying to understand what they were seeing while also trying not to see too much. Emergency services were called, but by the time the situation was brought under control, a young life had already been taken. What makes this case so disturbing is not only what happened, but where it happened, right in the open, surrounded by witnesses, in a place where safety is assumed rather than questioned. As news of the incident broke, it quickly spread far beyond London, drawing intense public attention and outrage. Now, with multiple suspects already charged, the questions only grow louder. How did it lead to this point? And what really happened in those critical moments that changed everything? In the hours that followed the attack, the atmosphere around Primrose Hill changed completely. What had been a place of open skis, families, and casual afternoon gatherings was suddenly transformed into a sealed-off scene of urgency and confusion. Police tape stretched across pathways where people had only recently been walking freely, and officers moved in controlled but tense patterns, documenting, questioning, and trying to piece together what had unfolded in those chaotic moments. For those who were present, the details were not arriving in a clean, linear story. They came in fragments, shouts heard from a distance, sudden movement in a group of individuals, the shock of realizing that what looked like a confrontation was turning into something far more serious. Several witnesses reportedly described the moment as too fast to process, where the brain struggled to keep up with what the eyes were seeing. At the center of it all was Finbar Sullivan, a 21-year-old film student whose presence in the park that day was, by all accounts, completely ordinary. Friends later described him as someone focused on his studies, creative work, and future in film, someone who moved through life with plans still being built rather than anything already defined. That contrast between a young person's future and the suddenness of what happened became one of the most difficult parts for the public to process. Early reports suggest that the attack involved a group of men, though the exact sequence of events has been carefully examined and remains subject to ongoing investigation. What is clear is that the situation escalated rapidly in a public space, with no opportunity for normal intervention before it turned violent. The fact that it unfolded in daylight, surrounded by members of the public, added another layer of shock that investigators would later have to factor into both witness statements and timeline reconstruction. One of the most challenging aspects for detectives was the number of perspectives involved. In a crowded park, every witness sees a slightly different version of the same event. Some were further away, catching only movement and confusion. Others were closer, but experiencing panic at the same time, which affects memory in unpredictable ways. Officers reportedly had to separate emotional reaction from factual consistency, a process that takes time and careful cross-checking. As the investigation began to take shape, attention quickly turned to identifying those involved. Within a short period, multiple individuals were detained and later charged in connection with the incident. However, even as arrests were made, investigators continued to work through the broader question of how the confrontation began in the first place. Was it spontaneous? Was there a prior exchange? Or did something escalate from an earlier, less visible interaction before the public even realized what was happening? These are the kinds of questions that define cases like this, not just what happened in the final moments, but what led to those moments becoming possible. The background of the investigation, digital evidence also began to play a role. In modern cases, especially those involving younger individuals, communication trails, location data, and social connections often become critical pieces of the puzzle. Investigators were reportedly reviewing messages, movements, and any prior links that could help establish context. But even with technology, the human element remains central. Data can show movement, but it cannot always explain intent. Meanwhile, the public reaction was immediate and intense. News of the incident spread quickly beyond London, amplified by the disturbing nature of the attack and the fact that it occurred in such a visible, open location. Social media filled with speculation, outrage, and grief, but also with misinformation, something that often complicates active investigations. Authorities had to repeatedly urge restraint, reminding the public that early details are often incomplete or subject to change as evidence is verified. For the family and friends of Finbar Sullivan, the situation was even more difficult. While the world discussed the case in headlines and comments, they were left confronting a personal loss that no public attention could soften. Those close to him reportedly described him as driven and full of creative ambition, someone whose work in film reflected a desire to understand people and stories. That detail, in particular, added a layer of emotional weight to how the case was received. As detectives continued their work, one of their key challenges became separating emotion from evidence. High-profile cases like this often generate pressure from media, from the public, and from the urgency of delivering answers. But the investigative process depends on patience. Every statement must be verified. Every timeline must be reconstructed. Every inconsistency must be examined rather than assumed. What emerged in the early phase of the investigation was not a simple narrative, but a layered and complex situation that required careful handling. Conflicting accounts needed to be reconciled. Movements of multiple individuals had to be mapped. And perhaps most importantly, the sequence of events leading up to the confrontation had to be understood in a way that could hold up in court, not just in public discussion. Even as arrests were made, one thing remained clear. The full story of what happened in the park was still far from complete. The visible moment of violence was only one part of a larger chain of events that investigators were still working to uncover. And until that chain was fully understood, many of the most important questions would remain open, hanging over the case like a shadow that had yet to be fully revealed. By the end of the first phase of the investigation, there was still no sense of closure, only the beginning of a process that would take time, scrutiny, and careful reconstruction of every detail. And as the case moved forward, one truth remained unavoidable. What happened at Primrose Hill had already changed lives forever, but the reasons behind it were still waiting to be fully uncovered. As the investigation moved beyond the initial shock phase, the focus shifted from the immediate aftermath to something far more difficult, reconstructing the exact chain of events that led to the confrontation in Primrose Hill. What began as scattered witness accounts and early arrests was now becoming a structured inquiry, where every second mattered and every detail had to be tested against another. Detectives working the case of Finbar Sullivan were no longer dealing with just the emotional weight of a public tragedy. They were now deep inside a complex timeline, trying to determine how a normal afternoon in a public park could escalate into fatal violence involving a group of individuals. The central challenge was not only identifying what happened, but understanding the sequence in which it happened, and why it escalated so quickly in such a visible space. One of the earliest difficulties was consistency. Witness statements, while crucial, often conflicted in small but important ways. Some people remembered seeing a verbal exchange before any physical movement. Others insisted the situation appeared to erupt suddenly without clear warning. A few described seeing a group approach, while others only noticed the movement once panic had already begun. This kind of fragmentation is common in fast-moving public incidents, where stress and fear affect perception in real time. Investigators had to carefully separate emotional recollection from factual alignment. That meant comparing multiple accounts, cross-referencing them with any available video footage, and attempting to anchor the timeline to verifiable moments. Even something as simple as determining the exact order of movement became a critical step in understanding intent. At the same time, attention turned toward the individuals now in custody. While legal restrictions limited what could be publicly confirmed, it was clear that multiple suspects had been charged in connection with the incident. Each of them represented a different part of the investigative puzzle. The question was not only what each person did, but how they interacted with one another in the moments leading up to the confrontation. In cases like this, group dynamics become just as important as individual actions. Investigators were reportedly examining whether the incident was pre-planned, escalated from a prior disagreement, or emerged spontaneously from a chance encounter. Each possibility carried a completely different implication, not just legally, but in understanding motive and intent. Digital evidence began to play a larger role in this phase of the investigation. Phones, messages, and location data were reviewed in an attempt to map movements before and after the incident. In modern investigations, these digital traces often provide a backbone for reconstructing timelines that human memory alone cannot reliably deliver. But even here, interpretation matters. Data can show proximity, but it cannot always explain context. As this work continued, public attention around the case intensified. The name Finbar Sullivan was now circulating widely online, often accompanied by speculation that moved faster than official updates. Social media became a parallel space where theories formed and spread rapidly, sometimes aligning loosely with facts, but often extending far beyond what investigators had confirmed. Authorities faced the growing challenge of managing not just the investigation itself, but the information environment surrounding it. Misinformation and assumptions began to blur the boundaries between confirmed evidence and public interpretation. Official statements became more cautious, emphasizing that early narratives often shift significantly as new findings emerge. Meanwhile, the human side of the case remained deeply present. Friends, classmates, and acquaintances of Finbar Sullivan were being interviewed, not just to provide factual information, but to help build a clearer picture of his life leading up to that day. They described him as someone deeply involved in creative work, particularly film, someone who saw storytelling as a way to understand people and emotion. That detail became especially significant because it grounded the case in something beyond the investigation. It reminded everyone that this was not just a file or a timeline, but a life with direction, ambition, and unfinished plans. Back at the scene in Primrose Hill, forensic teams continued their careful work long after the public had been cleared. Every marked point, every recovered item, every trace of disturbance in the environment was documented. In open-space investigations like this, the challenge is often that there are no controlled boundaries. Unlike an indoor scene, a park is fluid, affected by weather, movement, and time itself. That makes preservation of evidence both urgent and fragile. As days passed, investigators began to form a more structured understanding of the sequence of events, though many gaps still remained. They were building a framework but not yet a complete picture. Certain movements were becoming clearer. Certain interactions were being narrowed down. But the precise trigger, the moment everything shifted from normal public space to irreversible violence, was still under careful review. The emotional impact of the case also continued to expand beyond London. The idea that such an incident could happen in broad daylight, in a public park, unsettled people far beyond those directly connected. It raised broader questions about safety, unpredictability, and how quickly ordinary environments can become sites of tragedy. And yet, despite the growing attention, investigators remained focused on one principle: clarity over speed. Every conclusion had to be supported, not assumed. Every connection had to be proven, not inferred. By the end of this phase, the case had not become simpler, it had become deeper. The number of questions had not decreased, it had increased. What was once seen as a sudden act of violence was now revealing layers of complexity that would take time to fully understand. By the time the investigation entered its final stages, the case surrounding the death of Finbar Sullivan had already moved far beyond the boundaries of a single incident. What began as a sudden act of violence in Primrose Hill had now become a tightly examined case built on timelines, digital traces, witness reconstruction, and legal scrutiny that stretched across multiple lines of inquiry. At this point, detectives were no longer trying to understand what happened in broad terms. They were focused on precision. Every second of that afternoon was being broken down, reconstructed, and tested against physical evidence and verified movement data. The central aim was no longer just to build a narrative, but to establish a version of events strong enough to withstand court examination. What emerged from the final review of evidence was a clearer, though still deeply unsettling, sequence. Investigators had reportedly been able to align multiple sources, witness accounts, surveillance fragments from surrounding streets, and digital location data to narrow down the movements of the individuals involved. While not every detail was publicly disclosed, the overall structure of the event began to take shape with more certainty than before. It became increasingly clear that the confrontation did not exist in isolation. Instead, it appeared to have developed through a series of interactions leading up to the moment it escalated in the park. Whether those interactions were accidental, intentional, or influenced by prior tensions became one of the key questions at the heart of the case. And even as evidence pointed toward a clearer timeline, the underlying motivations remained carefully examined rather than assumed. For the individuals now charged in connection with the incident, the legal process became the next defining phase. Each suspect's role was being evaluated separately, with investigators and prosecutors working to determine degrees of involvement, responsibility, and intent. In group-linked violent cases, the law often distinguishes between direct action and collective participation, making the interpretation of evidence especially important. The court process also began to shift the public tone of the case. What had once been dominated by speculation and fragmented social media narratives was now being filtered through formal legal procedures. Lawyers on all sides were preparing arguments based on verified evidence, not public interpretation. Statements that had once circulated widely online were now being weighed against admissible facts and official records. Still, outside the courtroom, the emotional impact of the case remained powerful. The name Finbar Sullivan continued to appear in discussions, tributes, and conversations about youth violence and public safety. Friends and those who knew him personally described the difficulty of reconciling memory with media attention, how someone remembered for creativity, ambition, and personal growth could become central to a case defined by its violence. In the background, the park where it all happened, Primrose Hill, slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Grass was walked on again, paths filled with everyday movement, and life continued in a way that often feels disconnected from the events that once occurred there. But for those who followed the case closely, the location carried a lasting weight. It had become more than a public space. It had become a reference point for a moment when normality collapsed without warning. As the case progressed through legal stages, one of the most important developments was the gradual consolidation of evidence into a coherent, prosecutable timeline. This is often where investigations either strengthen or weaken, where uncertainty must either be resolved or openly acknowledged. In this case, authorities reportedly believed they had reached a point where the core sequence of events was sufficiently supported by multiple independent forms of evidence. However, even with that structure in place, not every question found a satisfying answer. Motive, in particular, remained an area of careful legal interpretation. Establishing what happened is one part of an investigation. Establishing why it happened is often far more complex, especially when multiple individuals are involved and accounts differ in detail or emphasis. As proceedings moved forward, the focus also shifted toward accountability. The legal system's role in cases like this is not only to determine guilt or responsibility, but to assign meaning to actions within the framework of law. That process is deliberate, structured, and often far slower than public expectation. But it is also where final clarity is expected to emerge. For the public, the case had already left a lasting impression. It raised uncomfortable questions about safety in public spaces, about how quickly group situations can escalate, and about the unpredictable nature of violence in everyday environments. These are not questions that end with a verdict. They tend to linger, shaping how people think about places they once considered entirely ordinary. For those closest to Finbar Sullivan, however, the legal outcome was only part of a much larger reality. No court decision could fully capture the personal loss, the interrupted future, or the absence left behind. His identity as a young film student, someone working to build a creative path, remained central in how he was remembered by those who knew him beyond the headlines. As the case moved toward its conclusion, investigators and legal teams continued refining the final presentation of evidence. Every detail had to be consistent. Every statement had to align. Every inference had to be supported. That level of precision is what transforms an investigation into a courtroom narrative. And yet, even as that process neared completion, the case did not fully close in the public mind. Some questions had been answered, others had been narrowed, but the emotional impact of what happened in Primrose Hill remained unresolved in a different sense, one that law cannot fully address. In the end, what remained was a combination of clarity and silence. Clarity in the sense that investigators had built a structured understanding of how events unfolded. Silence in the sense that no explanation could fully restore what was lost or erase the shock of how suddenly it happened. And so the story of Finbar Sullivan settled into a different space, not just as a case file or a court proceeding, but as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can shift into irreversible outcomes, and how some events continue to echo long after the final report is written.